Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from How to Dress Well, called Care. But first, let's briefly flash back to 2014. It's near the beginning of the summer. I just moved into this new apartment. I'm listening through the new How to Dress Well album, the PBR&B project from singer-songwriter Tom Krell, and even despite hitting the absolutely gorgeous song Poor Cyril that would later land on my list of my favorite songs of 2014, bar none, we then hit a bit of a snag. Even as that record is aspiring to be more of a pop sound compared to the heavy melancholy of Total Loss from 2012, I wasn't really certain he was pulling it off. His vocals were too thin and gentle, the self-absorbed bluntness not really fitting with the tones that he was chasing. It was the sort of album that had all the ingredients of an insightful and interesting and potent pop album, just ended up kind of missing the mark for me. So when I heard that Tom Krell was taking the How to Dress Well even further in a pop direction, recruiting Jack Antonoff of Fun and Bleachers and dancehall producer Dre Skull, I have to admit I was a little bit skeptical. On the one hand, sure, Jack Antonoff has a great ear for pop hooks and he's been the secret weapon behind some great songs and albums before, but on the other hand, the move to touch on some dancehall rhythms struck me as yet another artist hopping towards tropical sounds and again for a bid for the mainstream. See Luna George that I covered earlier this week, a lane that struck me as the completely wrong fit for Tom Krell. His writing might occasionally ring as simple and straightforward in a pop context, but his presentation demanded a lot of subtlety, and modern pop is nearly the furthest thing away from that right now. And given the lukewarm response to this album, I was kind of tentative to really dig in. But Tom Krell does have a gift for some really powerful, beautiful melodies, so I figured Care was probably worth a listen. Was I right? Well, yeah, it was worth a listen, if only because Tom Krell's approach to pop music on Care is genuinely fascinating, even if I would argue that it doesn't totally work. But man, I really wish it did, because I can really get behind the core of the idea on this album, and even a fair amount of the execution, but not really enough to elevate this album to greatness beyond fragments. And what's kind of fascinating is that you can tell that the raw talent is there to pull this sort of gorgeous, emotionally insightful pop record off, almost across the board. It just doesn't quite stick the landing as a whole, which is probably why more critics than usual have come down harder on this album compared to Tom Krell's work in the past. But look, I do want to highlight where this album does indeed go right, and the best place to start, the instrumentation and production. Because make no mistake, Tom Krell's always been a very potent melodic composer, and even if he was getting filtered through more mainstream production, I knew at a fundamental level the tunes would be here. And even though he does play fast and loose with the choruses, there are some really potent moments with real melodic swell and sparkle. Now, it helps that Care starts off really strong. Even though I do think the drums feel a tad too heavy, the piano against the bass groove on Can't You Tell is great, especially with the strings and the multi-tracking. And sure, What's Up, the tropical percussion did feel a little bit odd, along with the pseudo-rap delivery from Tom Krell in the verses, but the similar formula and vibe did flow pretty well. And I also really dug the horns and the guitar crescendos to support the hook on Made a Lifetime. Although, let's get real here, the best hook on this album by a mile is the album's standout Salt song, with that whistle and blurry guitar in the post-chorus. Sure, the song does run a little bit long, but it's one of the few cases where the song's explosion on the final minute of drums and guitar really pushed it over the top in the best way possible. Really like that song. But what stands out about a lot of these tracks is a fundamental melody anchoring the hooks in either the piano or the strings, and unfortunately, across a large swath of the rest of the album, Tom Krell doesn't really go in that direction. Instead, so much of modern pop, we've got overdubbed and layered vocal tracks against your thicker percussion, with grooves that aren't always anchored as strongly, which can be a real problem for momentum when the songs start to go long and start to drag or find themselves getting drowned out in their own blurry textures, like the cavernous mix and shrill keys on The Ruins, or the waves of bass that swamps out Time Was Meant to Stay, or the very shrill outro on the otherwise pretty decent song I Was Terrible. But overall, there is a lot of heft and swell and cleanness to a lot of the production that I actually quite liked, and Krell's heartfelt sincerity, it's a natural fit for it that might be a little rougher than, say, Vienna Tang, but never completely swallows itself in reverb like Licky Lee. I can appreciate that sort of sound, but here's where we have to run into the issue of Tom Krell himself. Suffice to say, despite some tonal similarities, he is not The Weeknd, or at least not is produced like The Weeknd to hold command of the mix in the same way, and his very willowy tones just don't have the presence to match the heavier beats or the drums or the roaring synth-touched guitars. Even with the multi-tracking, he often feels nestled into the mix, so fragile against the much thicker instrumentation that you would expect from modern pop. And here's the thing, it's not so much bad as that I'm aware if, say, Usher or even the main producer, Jack Antonoff, was the main singer, I'd probably get swept up in these songs and these hooks a lot more. He just kind of feels drowned out here. Granted, I doubt Usher or Jack Antonoff would be writing or singing songs like these, so let's dig into the content. And let me stress, again, I like the idea of what Tom Krell is doing with the How to Dress Well project. In comparison with so much of modern pop music, which can feel so dour and drab and relentlessly nihilistic, his is a plea for optimism and caring in an increasingly uncaring world. Show affection and compassion, and hell, I'm entirely on board with that sentiment. But the problem is how it plays out, because let's be blunt here, one of the greatest strengths of Tom Krell's writing on early How to Dress Well records was that his straightforward writing was given nuance by subtler instrumentation and his sensitive delivery. Form was matching function, but when you inflate a pop scope and the writing doesn't pick up more nuance, well, it's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you get away with that broad scope, but the focus of the content should come close to matching it, and that's where Care kind of flies off the rails, both in the language chosen and the actual content. His writing has always been kind of blunt, but when you have songs like Lost Youth, Lost You, or shows the breakup in real time with him unable to communicate with his partner except in an attempt to apologize by saying that he's garbage, it just feels kind of melodramatic that kind of fits the instrumentation, but not his delivery. Or take the open apology of I Was Terrible. The framing is honest, I can buy into the urgency of the song, but nowhere in the actual lyrics does he say the words I'm sorry. And it's here where you notice that the self-flagellation is starting to take more of a front seat than the actual person for whom Tom Krell is singing about. And once you notice that this record is much more focused on him trying to reconcile the idea of caring in the modern world instead of those actual relationships around him, the people impacted by him caring, well, if anything, it's even more of a mixed blessing. Salt's song might have some cringeworthy lines like, I want to learn to care for my soul, but as the track progresses, he sees how easy and liberating it is to feel happy to care for others, even if that honesty and openness can be a risk and a danger in the modern world. And this is where the track sequencing becomes a real issue, because right after that bright spot of optimism for the first 3 songs, we get hits with lines like on The Ruins, what is truly caring? It's a blurry line. All the people staring is what I always had in mind. In other words, to quote Wicked, was I really seeking good or just seeking attention? It's a fine concept, but the framing doesn't use that snapshot of self-awareness to inform later songs like Anxious, where he has nightmares about his Twitter mentions and oversharing online and just wants to fade back into anonymity like everybody else. Or on They'll Take Everything You Have, which plays very much to how self-serving society is, constantly taking that all that he is giving you. And the fact that this is the root of the drama bothers me on some level. The fact that altruism is such a struggle for this guy feels kind of self-serving in the way that it's presented, which would be less of an issue if that inward focus wasn't a running theme of his last 3 albums. Even at the end of the record on Untitled, where he's trying to write a song to help a child learn to live with sadness and still be able to give of themselves and love, the narrative shifts, not to giving to another, but just another message to himself, and that he shouldn't give up. All that loving that he's doing is the right direction. It's a fine enough ending, I guess, but if the focus was more intimate, which it isn't, but considering how often he brings up world-breaking calamities in 2016 throughout the album, it can feel a little bit narcissistic and almost adolescent when you place it all in context. You know, there's a Texas country artist named Cody Jinks that released a fantastic album earlier this year that I reviewed called I'm Not the Devil, and on that record was a song called Give All You Can. And the message of that song really has stuck with me, acknowledging those that give of themselves in your life, the angels that might help you in ways you barely ever remember, and thus whenever you have a chance to be that angel for somebody else, give all you can and expect nothing in return, which, come to think of it, that's what love is in not too many words. And I love that song because there isn't that moral paralysis that afflicts Care by How to Dress Well. Hell, it's one of the reasons that the best songs on this album for me are when Tom Krell gives him himself and doesn't expect anything back. Like the Positive Consent of Can't You Tell, or even just the Little Promise of Made a Lifetime that I really appreciated. Maybe it's just poor sequencing that this album doesn't come to that climax of emotional maturity sooner, but even with that, the internal focus just doesn't sit well with this material. And when you pair it with a very earnest delivery and yet too thin for all the bombast behind him in the instrumentation, it leads to a record with really good intentions that I really want to like, but one that kind of ends up swallowing its own tail and sacrificing a lot of its power as a result. So for me, strong 6 out of 10 and a modest recommendation. It's a record that could have easily been great and actually a real fascinating to write and talk about, but it's pretty decent and worth a listen regardless. If only for Salt Song and Made a Lifetime, which are fantastic. Either way, Tom Krell seems to have finally found his courage to give, and as much as I appreciate the ideas here, I'm definitely curious to see what he gives us next. In other words, check this out. It is kind of worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I got the poll up here. I can imagine this album might be a little polarizing. I know I've said this a number of times, you guys are commenting on that, but honestly, this one in particular, because I think the pop shift is kind of interesting, and a lot of the themes actually might have some real resonance. I'm curious to see where you guys take this. Honestly, I had so much fun writing about this album. Reminds me of why I do this critic thing. And yeah, I'm not just hating, I actually do enjoy what I'm doing here. Beyond that, anything else what I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'll be glad to give them a listen. Got a heavy schedule coming up the next couple of days. I'll be working as fast as I can. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.